This was one of Europe's largest steelworks just a decade ago, and this is what it looks like today. With Britain's steel industry collapsing and thousands of jobs disappearing overnight, the question is simple: what now? To try and get a clearer answer, I dug through the site's history, the money trail, and the political fallout that's followed it ever since. Seeing a once thriving industrial giant reduced to rubble is just plain sad. Demolition already happened here on a massive scale, but what's replacing it is one of the most ambitious and most controversial regeneration projects in the country. Today we'll look at the odds of Teesworks actually delivering on its promises, why it's become a national scandal, and the broader context around one of the UK's most disputed megaprojects. Steelmaking on Teesside dates back to the 19th century, and the site on the banks of the River Tees, home to the Redcar works, became the beating heart of British steel production. For generations, iron and steel shaped the local economy, pulling in workers from across the country and turning Teesside into an industrial powerhouse. At its peak, the plant employed thousands and fed steel into bridges, ships, and buildings across the world. But by the 2010s, cheap imports and falling demand had gutted the industry's profitability. In October 2015, the Thai-owned steelmaker SeAH shut down the loss-making plant for good, ending centuries of steelmaking on Teesside. Around 2,200 direct jobs were lost, with thousands more affected across the wider supply chain. Banks in Thailand took receivership of the site, and for years it sat as a rusting monument to industrial decline. 2,500 acres of contaminated land with no clear future. That began to change in 2017, when Ben Houchen was elected as the first Tees Valley mayor. He moved quickly, negotiating with the Thai banks over the site's future and forming the South Tees Development Corporation, the first development corporation created outside London. The plan was a 25-year vision to transform the old steelworks into a hub for green energy, offshore wind manufacturing, and advanced industry. In 2020, a compulsory purchase order brought the land into public ownership, and the same year, local property developers Chris Musgrave and Martin Corney entered the picture. They'd already bought an adjacent site from the Redcar bulk terminal, whose owners had lost their main income when the blast furnace closed. Houchen has repeatedly said their involvement was crucial to unlocking the site's redevelopment. A joint venture called Teesworks Limited was set up, initially split 50-50 between the public South Tees Development Corporation and the two private developers. The goal was to market the land, attract inward investment, and eventually bring an estimated 20,000 jobs to the region. As demolition crews moved in, the old landmarks came down one by one. The Dorman Long Coal Tower, a brutalist concrete structure beloved by locals, was demolished overnight in 2021 after a controversial back and forth over its heritage listing. The site's last blast furnace followed just over a year later. The skyline that had defined Teesside for generations was gone within a couple of years. But while the physical site was transforming, so were the financial arrangements behind the scenes, and this is where the story turns into a national controversy. In August 2021, the joint venture agreement was quietly amended, and the 50-50 split was changed to 90-10 in favor of the private developers. Musgrave and Corney's companies ended up controlling 90% of the equity in the vehicle, overseeing hundreds of millions of pounds in public investment, and they received this majority stake at no additional cost. According to the government's own Tees Valley Review, published in January 2024, more than £560 million of public money had been spent or committed on the project, while, in the review's words, no private finance had been invested to date. The details that came out afterward only made things murkier. In December 2022, the first parcel of remediated land, 90 acres, was sold to Teesworks Limited for £1 per acre. A side agreement was supposed to net the taxpayer £15 million for the site, but only £5 million of that had actually been paid by early 2023, with the remaining £10 million not due until the end of 2025. The private partners then turned around and sold a 40-year lease on that same 90-acre plot to the Australian financial giant Macquarie for £93.3 million in cash. Macquarie's lease agreement pays the Tees Valley Combined Authority £3.65 million a year, which is then sublet to the eventual tenant, offshore wind manufacturer SeAH Wind, who will pay roughly £4.3 million a year once their factory is built. Critics argued that companies linked to the private partners stood to receive tens of millions of pounds through lease arrangements and related agreements, from a project the public was still funding. Unsurprisingly, this triggered political fireworks. Opposition politicians, including Labour's Lisa Nandy, called for a full National Audit Office investigation, accusing the scheme of cronyism. Houchen, for his part, has consistently denied any corruption or illegality, and at one point publicly requested an investigation himself, saying he wanted the allegations nipped in the bud. The government eventually commissioned an independent review rather than a full NAO audit. When it was published in early 2024, it found no evidence of corruption or illegality, but it did conclude that decisions made by the bodies involved had not met the standards expected when managing public money. That finding hasn't ended the debate. As recently as late 2025, MPS was still pushing for a fuller independent inquiry with evidence taken under oath, arguing that oversight of mayoral devolution deals across the country remains far too weak. So, with all that baggage, what's actually happening on the ground? Despite the controversy, momentum at the site hasn't stalled. The month after the government review was published, Zero Teesside and the Northern Endurance Partnership were granted development consent to build a gas-fired power station with carbon capture and storage next to the old blast furnace site. It's a joint venture involving BP, Equinor, Eni, National Grid, Shell, and Total, aiming to be the world's first gas-fired plant of its kind paired with carbon capture at this scale. The project has moved into its execution phase, with construction and site preparation now underway. It is expected to support around 3,000 construction jobs and roughly 1,000 long-term jobs across the wider Teesside cluster, once operational in 2028. The wider carbon capture cluster was part of a £22 billion government funding commitment announced in October 2024. More recently, Teesworks pushed into an entirely new lane, announcing plans in 2025 for a 500,000 square metre AI data centre, right on the same footprint as BP's planned H2 Teesside blue hydrogen project. For months, the two schemes were locked in a standoff over the same patch of land, with BP arguing the hydrogen plant and data centre could coexist, and Teesworks countering that the hydrogen project would sterilize the site's future potential. In the end, it wasn't close. After the data center secured local planning permission in August 2025, and with hydrogen demand in the area already weakening following the closure of a major chemical plant nearby, BP formally withdrew its H2 Teesside application that December, clearing the way for the data center to go ahead. Meanwhile, other developers originally eyeing the Teesworks site, like battery storage firm Nat Power, have simply relocated their plans a few kilometers away to Wilton International instead, partly because parts of the flagship site still aren't fully remediated or available. That's really the tension running through this whole story. Teesworks likes to advertise its roughly 1,450 acres of usable land as one continuous opportunity, but in reality, it's fragmented into smaller zones, some allocated to energy and fuel projects, some tied up in disputes, and some still undergoing basic land remediation years after demolition began. The remains of the old blast furnace, which officials promised would be cleared by mid-2024, are still sitting there. So, does the maths work? In theory, Teesworks has almost everything a regeneration project could ask for: a huge brownfield site, deep water access on the Tees, direct rail and road links, and a government desperate to show that levelling up the north isn't just a slogan. The offshore wind and carbon capture ambitions, along with the site's growing push into AI infrastructure, genuinely align with where UK industrial policy appears to be heading. But the governance scandal has cost the project years of political goodwill and scrutiny it didn't need. And the gap between the £5 billion plus investment vision regularly cited by officials and the verified private money actually spent so far remains enormous. For Teesworks to succeed, it has to do two things at once: deliver enough real revenue-generating tenants like SeAH Wind and the new power station to prove the industrial vision works, while also settling the ownership and accountability questions that have dogged it since 2021. If it manages both, Teesside could genuinely become the green energy hub the government keeps promising. If it doesn't, it risks becoming another case study in how a good redevelopment idea can be undermined by how the money was handled behind the scenes. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time.